So thank you, Bob, for that introduction, Alan for joining us today, and Karen Anderson for everything you do to organize these terrific events. It's good to be back with the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution. Your work has consistently both advanced analytically sound policy ideas, but also fostered a broader, rigorous discussion about the most important issues facing our country. And perhaps the most important economic issue facing our country today is the state of the job market. In my remarks, I want to discuss the progress we've made in healing from the recession, of the worst recession since the Great Depression, but also some of the challenges that we face and what we're doing to meet those challenges. Some of those challenges are the consequence of the Great Recession themselves, but many of the largest and deepest ones predated the recession, were decades in the making, and will take a long time on a serious effort to recover from. In the course of these remarks, I'll be drawing on a new report that the Council of Economic Advisors released this morning and should be on our website, on the labor force participation rate, which has been one of the most puzzling, and I think for many people, one of the most misunderstood aspects of the labor market recovery in recent years. I'll also touch more briefly on wages, inequality, job quality, all of which are extremely important topics which could be the subject of several speeches of their own, so it's only time constraints that will prevent me from discussing them more. There is a version of these remarks that should be posted on our website momentarily that's slightly expanded from what I'll be sharing with you right now. To put some context on what we've seen in the labor market, I'll put the unemployment rate up here. And I remember in 2009, Larry Summers asked Alan Krueger, who then was the Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Treasury, a question. The question was that in 2009, the unemployment rate went up much further, much faster than anyone expected. If you looked at the survey of professional forecasters, as recently as November 2008, they projected by the second quarter of the next year, just 6 months in the future, the unemployment rate would be 7.4%. Instead, it was 9.3%. Larry's question was simple. We know the unemployment rate can rise rapidly, but how rapidly can it fall? Alan's answer was sobering. In recent decades, according to his analysis, a half dozen OECD countries had seen their unemployment rate jump up by 4 percentage points in a 2-year period. But in all of these cases, the average annual decline of the unemployment rate once the economy started recovering was just 0.4 percentage point per year. The best case in the OECD in recent decades had been a 0.7 percentage point per year decline in the unemployment rate. And this was averaging across all recessions. And we know that the type of recession we went through, a financial crisis, is particularly severe. And as Carmen Reinhart and Vincent Reinhart showed, in 10 out of 15 countries that went through those types of crises, their unemployment rate didn't return even a decade after the crisis. That analysis was prescient for Europe, which currently has an unemployment rate of 11.6%, barely down from its 12% peak in 2013. That analysis, though, was overly pessimistic for the United States, and I think in large part due to the vigorous multi-front response to the economic crisis, the United States has enjoyed a sustained economic recovery. In the first years of that recovery, the unemployment rate was falling 0.7 percentage point per year, equal to the maximum amount that Alan had found following previous big increases in unemployment. And over the last year, the pace of decline in the unemployment rate has doubled from that. That's been one of the most unexpectedly positive economic surprises we've seen in years. Just to put it in some context, for the last several years, if you asked the blue chip where the unemployment rate would be right now, they would have said above 7%. As recently as last year, the blue chip said we wouldn't get to a 6.2% unemployment rate until 2017. As you see in the figure, we got to 6.1% in June, 3 years ahead of what was expected just last year. A number of other indicators show the recent strengthening in labor markets. That unemployment rate decline of 1.4 percentage points in the last year is the fastest in nearly 30 years. The participation rate, which I'll discuss in much more detail, appears to be stabilizing. Job growth strengthened over the course of the year with 1.4 million jobs added in the first 6 months of this year, the best first half of a year since 1999. Steve did a good column today or yesterday on part-time employment. It bounces around. It's very noisy month to month. Look at it over the last year. 99% of the jobs added have been full-time jobs. And finally, wage growth has picked up and is somewhat faster than inflation. All of this is the culmination of 52 straight months of private sector job growth, the longest such streak in the nation's history. Nevertheless, there are substantial fluctuations from month to month, and there's always significant uncertainty, especially about any one data point or any one month. Now, a wide range of labor market indicators do tell this same consistent story. We're now far into the recovery from the Great Recession, but we're not all the way there yet. The clearest measure of this is the unemployment rate, which, and I'll explain this chart when I get to some of the other ones. The unemployment rate, which rose from 5.3%, its average during the 2001 through 2007 expansion, to peak at 10% in October 2009. It's since fallen back to 6.1%, which is unacceptably high, but as you see in that last column there, is 83% of the way back to its pre-recession value. The short-term unemployment rate, the percentage of the labor force unemployed 26 weeks or less, is now slightly below its pre-crisis average, and you see it's recovered more than 100%. The long-term unemployment rate, those unemployed for 27 weeks or longer, remains elevated. In the recession, the long-term unemployment rate more than quadrupled, as opposed to the short-term unemployment rate, which was only up 60%. The long-term unemployment rate has fallen steadily, and recently has fallen at an even faster rate than short-term unemployment, closing nearly 3/4 of the gap to its pre-recession level. The fact that the long-term unemployment rate has come down without any concurrent spike in measures of marginal attachment to the labor force or worker discouragement suggests to me that the decline in the long-term unemployment rate represents a genuine healing. But the experience we have come through with respect to long-term unemployment is without precedent, and we're still understanding the full implications. Indeed, the long-term unemployment rate is still twice as high as what it was prior to the recession, and higher than almost any period since we started collecting data in 1948. The prepared version of this goes in more detail into a range of gender, ethnic, racial, and educational groups. The bottom line being that they've all seen relatively similar magnitudes of recovery, but for example, the fact that the African American unemployment rate is 87% back to its pre-recession average is of little comfort when that pre-recession average was an extremely high 9.8%. So the structural problems are very much still with us, the recovery proceeding in a roughly parallel way. I wanted to address, because Bob brought it up in his opening, and a lot of people discuss a range of broader measures of the labor market. Some people will call it the true unemployment rate, and whether you agree with that definition or not, a variety of these measures are informative about the state of the labor market. And as you see in the slide, a variety of these measures show pretty much the same picture as the official unemployment rate. Take what the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls U5. This is the broadest measure they produce of people without jobs. It includes both the officially unemployed and also the marginally attached. That's a group of people who would like a job, but they're not looking, either because they're discouraged or for some other reason. During the recession, this measure rose proportionately just about as much as the official unemployment rate, and in the recovery, it's come down by 79%, again, about the same magnitude of the recovery that we've seen in the official unemployment rate. And right now, it is 18% above where it was in the last recovery, as compared to the unemployment rate, which is 16% above where it was. So broadly speaking, it's telling a similar story. And it's telling a similar story because discouraged and other marginally attached workers have clearly been recovering, although, as with everything else, not all the way there yet. An even more expansive measure of labor market underutilization is U6. This includes both the people without jobs that we talked about in U5, and it also includes people working part-time for economic reasons or involuntary part-time workers. The U6 has also come down steadily, falling by a total of 5 percentage points from its peak, but it remains 3 percentage points above its pre-crisis rate, indicating a smaller recovery relative to its original base than you see for the unemployment rate. The main reason for the elevation in U6 is people working part-time for economic reasons. That's a group that expanded dramatically during the recession. In the course of the recovery, 90% of the jobs added have been full-time, 99% of the jobs in the past year, but there's still further to go to deal with that large run-up. I'd also note, if you look at another measure of how much people are working, average weekly hours, that is almost entirely recovered back to where it was pre-recession. All of this is important because unemployment, as we all know, has very serious consequences. Research shows that even once reemployed, displaced workers face significant earnings losses in the form of wages that are on average 15% below their pre-displacement level. Such losses can persist for a lifetime and affect family members as well. Unemployment also matters because it affects the degree to which workers have leverage to ask for wage increases that are commensurate with the productivity that they're generating in the economy. And the next figure shows that as labor markets tightened, nominal earnings, which is the green line there, have started to grow at a faster rate, are growing somewhat faster than inflation, but are still below productivity growth and nowhere near what you would need to make up for decades of stagnation. So you may have noticed one indicator that wasn't in the previous table and that features prominently in discussions of labor markets, and that is the participation rate. While the unemployment rate and a range of other indicators are coming down and are on track to return to pre-crisis rates, the participation rate is a different story. As is widely known, it has fallen over the course of the recovery, although it appears to have stabilized recently, even as the unemployment rate has continued to come down sharply. Unlike the unemployment rate and the other indicators I showed in that table, however, we wouldn't expect the participation rate to return to its pre-crisis levels, and in fact, we weren't expecting that even prior to the crisis. To understand that, ask someone in 2006 what they would project the unemployment rate would be in 2014, or the unemployment rate for black men, or the unemployment rate for women with a college degree. Probably what that person would do is look at the average for that group in the last couple years and assume we'd have that same unemployment rate in 2014. And if you made that type of projection, you'd be pretty accurate. You'd be a little bit off because of the recession. However, if you'd asked the same person to forecast the participation rate, they would have done nothing of the sort. Rather than looking backwards at the last couple of years, they would have looked forwards. And they would have known that the first baby boomers were born in 1946, would turn age 62 in 2008, and become eligible for Social Security, and that there's a large decline in the participation rate for people as they enter their 60s. That decline in the participation rate was predictable, and it was predicted. For example, in 2004, the economic report of the president talked about how the participation rate was going to come down for the next several years, and then stated that, quote, the decline may be greater, however, after 2008. Someone in 2006 trying to predict the participation rate might have gone further than just looking at what was going on with the age structure of the population. And they might have noticed, as we see in this next figure, that the labor force participation rate for prime age men, age 25 to 54, has been falling steadily since 1953 due to a range of causes that we could discuss and debate, but probably include technology, shift from manufacturing, and certain aspects of globalization. They would also have noticed that in 2006, the labor force participation rate for prime age women was lower than it was a decade earlier in 1996, even though the unemployment rate was also lower. And that might have led them to suspect that above and beyond the trends associated with the age structure of the population, there may be additional reasons why, even conditional on a given age, the participation rate would fall. In fact, a 2006 Brookings paper by 5 Federal Reserve economists, who are some of the leading students of this topic, used this observation to predict that in 2014, the labor force participation rate would be 62.9%, almost exactly the 62.8% that it actually was in the second quarter. I say this not to say that everything in their model was correct and their thinking has evolved and there was a recession that they hadn't factored in when they wrote their paper in 2006, but just to suggest there was good reason to expect both an age-related decline and then a broader demographic decline. Today, the Council of Economic Advisors is releasing a new study, and I want to thank Jim Stock and Betsy Stevenson, the 2 members, for their tremendous contributions. And I'm going to mispronounce your last name, even though you've worked there last year, John Coglianese, for his tireless work on the report, which has been really terrific. And we try to be pretty comprehensive, and I'll just do a quick summary here. The first thing we look at is the causes of the decline in the participation rate. And our analysis puts us right in the middle of the range of a range of studies that have been done in recent years, and pretty similar to the way CBO has looked at it. In particular, from 2007 Q4 through 2014 Q2, the participation rate has fallen by 3.1 percentage point. We think that 1.6 percentage point of that decline, half of that decline, is due to the aging of the population. And this is a relatively straightforward calculation that just says, let's hold the participation rates constant where they were at the end of 2007 and just let the age composition vary. The second cause is the business cycle. And our statistical analysis shows It's a little more complicated than this, but it can be summarized with a rule of thumb that for every 1 percentage point the unemployment rate is elevated, the participation rate is about 0.2 percentage point lower than it otherwise would have been. This, when you account for lags and other things, gets you 0.5 off the participation rate. Importantly, and I'll get to the outlook for participation, we very much expect that cyclical component to go away. And when it goes away, it'll bring in another 1.3 million workers back into the labor force over time. The remaining 1.0% decline in the participation rate is unsatisfactorily labeled residual. And we've worked hard to try to understand exactly what that residual is. We have a lot of different fragmentary pieces of evidence that help get at it, but I don't think any definitive answer to what it is. I think part of it probably is a continuation of those trends that were unrelated to aging, although it's important to note those trends go in different directions. Older workers working more, for example, while younger workers were working less. Another possibility that is likely to explain at least a portion of the decline is the very severe recession and its unique characteristics. And in particular, in our statistical analysis, we find that residual, not just in this recession, but historically, is very correlated with long-term unemployment. So whatever is causing the unusually high long-term unemployment may also be causing some of the larger than expected reduction in the participation rate. We also looked at some of the other explanations for why participation has fallen. Two of them that to us didn't at least explain this residual are school enrollment and disability. Disability insurance always goes up during recessions. It always goes up when the unemployment rate goes up. The question is, did it go up more than you would have expected in this recession? Does it explain some of the puzzle, or is it part of the normal business cycle? And this next figure sheds a little bit of a light on that. The red line is what we would have projected given the past trends and relationship between disability and unemployment. The black line is what we've actually seen. It's well within the margin of error, but if anything, the puzzle is that disability insurance has grown less than we would have expected given the large rise in the unemployment rate in the recession. Everything I've been talking about is aggregates for the participation rate. There's a lot of really important observations about different demographic groups. I'll just briefly point out a few of them. The first is young people. We're all familiar with the decline in the participation rate there. It's something that began around the late 80s. But what we also show is if you look at the share enrolled in school or participating in the labor force, that has been pretty much constant over that period. One of the, I guess we don't have the old people, but another chart is the participation rate for older individuals has risen. I think an important and underappreciated story is what's happened with prime-age women, and it's an issue we've paid a lot of attention to at CEA and in the administration lately. There had been a huge surge of women into the labor force in the 1970s, 1980s, and beginning of the 1990s, but that surge stalled and may even have slightly started to reverse itself. As a result, the United States was a leader among many of its peer countries as recently as 1990, and now we've fallen behind a large range of other countries in female labor force participation, and even Japan is catching up with the United States. Men have experienced a substantial decline in prime-age men in their labor force participation and unemployment. That is a trend over the course of the last 60 years, and you see it starkly in the employment population ratio, which over the course of that 64-year period fell from 92% to 83%. The fall is even larger for black men who started out lower than white and fell even further, all of that being even more pronounced for younger workers. This diagnosis of the causes of the decline in the participation rate helps to inform our understanding of its evolution in the current years. The aging trend will continue to push the participation rate down by about 0.2 percentage point per year for the foreseeable future. As the economy continues its recovery, the cyclical component of the decline in the participation rate should disappear, adding 0.5 percentage point to the participation rate over time, those 1.3 million workers I mentioned before. And then finally, there's the residual part of the participation rate. And without fully understanding the causes of it, it's hard to be confident in any particular prediction of it. But certainly one would expect that at least a decent portion of it is due to the Great Recession, and at least a decent portion is something we could recover from as we recover from the Great Recession. The next figure here shows a number of different scenarios for the participation rate. And these are all different assumptions on the pace of decline of the cyclical component, the pace and degree of decline in the residual component, and the question of whether there is an unfavorable non-aging trend above and beyond the aging trends. But all of those lines spread out a decent amount, but tell a pretty consistent story, which is that over the next couple of years, you would expect the participation rate to stabilize as the recovery in the economy offsets the demography. But then after the economy recovers, that downward trend would reassert itself. Want to talk very briefly about what this means for the Obama administration's agenda and what we're trying to accomplish in the economy. Everything I just showed in terms of the participation rate is what would happen absent any changes in policy. Some of those changes are actually good. The fact that people are able to enjoy dignified retirements is one of the strengths of the American economy and American society. Nevertheless, the declining participation rate also subtracts from potential economic growth and exacerbates our future fiscal problems, which is why, looking at the participation rate narrowly or the labor market more broadly, we're focused on 4 areas, and as with everything, focused both on legislation and what we can do administratively in each of these areas. The first is to strengthen the economic recovery, especially for the long-term unemployed, and that includes everything from infrastructure investment, what we're doing in the overall budget. The housing recovery is especially critical to that, the debate over the Export-Import Bank. And it's important to understand that anything we do that brings down the unemployment rate will bring down the long-term unemployment rate, but the long-term unemployed have a unique set of challenges, which is why we've wanted to extend unemployment insurance, and why one of the first things the president did this year was bring a set of employers to the White House, including 300 of them, 20 of the Fortune 50, to make commitments to better hiring practices for the long-term unemployed, and the federal government did the same. Second, strengthening the economy will help strengthen wages, but there's things we need to do above and beyond that, whether it's the minimum wage, improving the bargaining power of workers, or education, training, and better matching to jobs. Third, that longer run trend in the participation rate, one of the big dials we have there is immigration reform. Immigration reform wouldn't just expand the population, it would expand the fraction of the population that is working age, and CBO estimates it would raise the participation rate by 0.7 percentage point. And then workplace flexibility policies and a range of other initiatives could help deal with issues like the female labor force participation that I showed. Finally, there are these even longer standing and deeper challenges that we face, including prime age men and young men of color. And that's an area where infrastructure would once again help put people back to work, expanding the earned income tax credit, and especially a bipartisan proposal the president has in his budget to expand it for childless workers and non-custodial parents, and then an initiative that we have, My Brother's Keeper, focused on helping young men of color participate in the labor force. In conclusion, we now stand at 52 consecutive months of private sector job growth and counting. The jobs that have comprised this progress have been overwhelmingly full-time, with their promise of restoring sound financial footing to millions of American households. And the unemployment rate has come down, together with reductions in discouraged workers, marginally attached workers more broadly, and part-time jobs, representing a genuine improvement in labor utilization. Yet significant challenges remain. Even at a strong pace of recovery, the depth of the recession means that a full recovery will still take more time. A steady decline in the long-term unemployment rate is little consolation to the remaining 2% of the labor force who have been out of work for 27 weeks or more. Demographic shifts and high levels of unemployment even before the recession continue to make the recovery challenging. For many more Americans, the biggest challenge they face is growing their wages. We've seen a falling unemployment rate translate into a pickup in wage growth, but it still does not match productivity growth, let alone come close to making up for what we need. The good news is that we're making progress on all these fronts, and they are complementary steps to strengthen the economy, increase demand, and increase growth, will ultimately translate into higher wages and incomes for American families. The key is to continue to move forward on all of these steps. Thank you.